Chapter 59. To say that mother had been distant was untrue. In her own way, she had cared very deeply about all her children, as had father. But that way was a distant way, and even when she drew close, it hung over her actions, so that Leopold had no clue whether or not he could confide in her. Not that Leopold liked to confide in others, or was very good at it. Trusting someone was scary. It meant opening up to them, admitting they had flaws, the image you built of them, of lazy days and lazy smiles and moth wings, it was all imperfect. A kind of fantasy. Then, they had the gift of one more truth, one more thing admitted carelessly that they could use to destroy you. To humiliate and knock your legs out from under you, just to see the dirt around your fingers as you tried to pull yourself back up. So when he spoke freely, he had learned first caution, and then sarcasm. The first was wise, and the second made him popular, in a kind of way. It had not won him renown or respect, yet people seemed to find it charming. Traitors would act as if he were more clever than he was, simply because he had cut them down, and striking first just made it an easier habit to fall into. When his family had grown distant in the years after father had passed and mother had left, that was when he had first become aware of, and mastered the art of distance. The varying degrees of learning to hold yourself away from people, of removing cares before they could develop into weakness. And perhaps his health had suffered for it, and he woke up alone, and afraid. But fear was its own power, and if all it had taken to master that power was distance and loss, it seemed a worthy trade. Had seemed a worthy trade, perhaps, at the time. Leopold knew he was falling, both in his thoughts and from a great height. He did not recall the strange man they had spoken to pushing him, or in any way attempting to cause him harm. He simply recalled the world fading out, and himself falling as it did. He had wanted to talk to her, for a while longer. Lorelei was a strange girl. With her mussed, fawn brown hair, and ready smile, she seemed both capable of keeping her distance without sacrificing her own cares, without sacrificing kindness. He was not upset at her talent, of course, he had devoted his life to his craft, but magic was as much about the heart and soul of a being as it was study or patterns or rules. What he could create, or imitate in a crude fashion, she believed and could initiate, and there was no use in holding a grudge, even as tempting as jealousy could be. Even if he fell forever, he would eventually die from lack of food, and then most likely wake up, to be punished or toyed with again. Such it had been for ages, so long perhaps that he could not remember much more than the joys and losses of it all, and the gnawing of the void, so tantalizingly close at hand, and yet so terrifying. Mr. Mammon would probably end up returning to whatever realm the demons of this place called home, or traveling more. He had no clear goal besides acquiring wealth, and then spending it, seemingly without care. Perhaps he had goals, actually, and Leopold had simply been so blinded by his own ambitions to fail at seeking them out. The demon merchant was loyal though, to a fault. Even with the sensation of falling everywhere around him, Leopold could manage to move his fingers to his beard, and pull on it contemplatively. Peculiar, to be falling and ruminating about such things, but with nothing, save time. Had he ever given Mammon thanks for his service, genuine thanks, not expressed through some trinket or cursory glance, but a meaningful expression of pride, and of friendship? More to the point, Crimsaleno. Leopold felt at home in his own mind, where the safety of each whirring gear could conspire and plan without the prison of a weak body holding it back. And in his mind, he had always felt that there was an order to things, perhaps even a sacred order, one that by birth or by duty, and perhaps even by random idol, he was bound to enforce. She had been trapped for some time, had she not? And though he had doubted in the first place that she'd grow free of the damnable curse, it did not befit a noble to be stuck in the body of a great bird, no matter how comfortable she may have grown in it. He had not cared so much at the time, but care was a funny thing, like distance, it had a way of closing when you least expect it. The ground crunched beneath him with surprising force. It was, after all, quite solid. Damnation! Leopold wheezed, and then swore profusely. Every single foul curse he had ever heard chained together in a beautiful litany of profanity that might have made goddesses weep and guardians frown, had either deigned to listen. Instead, back bent towards the air and limbs flailing, the old man did his level best to stop swearing and start breathing, the flush leaving his cheeks as gentle rain flowed. Ah! Leopold did not take long trying to figure out why the rain was floating upwards, though of course he was interested in it. There are things to investigate, and those to immediately regard as hostile. When the world itself began to fray, he could recognize the place well enough. The chalet in front of him looked quite familiar. After all, he had been here before. Limestone that had once served as the tiled and enameled gateway around an open-air pool or bath complex that had grown over with algae seemed all that was left of the Earl's domain. Whatever human, or human-like, for Leopold had always mistrusted the people of this place, presence had long since fled, and what they had taken. If someone had been about, he might have thrown a tantrum or raged ineffectually, but the secret to losing your temper is that it's always done with a purpose, to intimidate, or to attract attention, or perhaps to relieve the exhaustion of a world that doesn't care. And Leopold was alert, not exhausted, and the rest all seemed rather pointless when, for the first time in a long time, what he wanted was a friend.
Crimsolino! Mr. Mammon!
He bellowed into the gentle, if strange, night. Only an echo returned to him. An echo, and a rumble. Beneath his feet, one of the stone tiles detached itself, revealing itself not to be a piece of errant masonry, but something else entirely. It would not have been wrong to imagine it a boulder, because, well, that's what it was. Imperfectly spherical, covered in rocky crags and crystalline outgrowths, shining a prismatic and concerned yellow, and dripping water to the ground around itself. Leopold scowled.
You should probably go away. I'm amazed there are still some of you left. I'm quite the grand architect, after all. I thought I had found a place for all of you.
The little boulder promptly rolled onto his leg, and then seemed disappointed when Leopold gave no reaction at all, if that's what its sudden shift into a color reminiscent of purple was.
With that attitude, I'm not surprised if the rest of your silicon-based friends just up and wandered off after everything collapsed. If you're lucky, they found somewhere that's kind enough to tolerate blank slates. Ah, ha.
It wasn't a funny joke, and he didn't really plan to laugh, but the lone boulder didn't seem quite so angry, having returned to its earlier shade of yellow. Above, the rain had stopped flowing backwards, but there was a strange tension to the sky that made Leopold wonder if it might just all implode around them, but despite his morbid imaginings, it just remained thick and heavy above, while he lay against his cane in the courtyard of a dead man with a lone and speechless living stone.
For what it is worth, I'm sorry. I truly am. When there is no point for as long as there is, you just see everything so. You found yourself without recourse. Nothing has any greater meaning than what you can take from it, which only leads weaker souls to find value only in the waking world. I, unfortunately, being amongst them.
Eyes skyward, Leopold shot the tiny rock a skeptical glance, perhaps hoping it might join in his philosophizing, or understand what he said. And it might have understood, but it did not and could not reply, only switching the light that shone from its stone, blue to white, to blue once more. It also seemed to be staring into the sky.
Terrifying, isn't it? Death is terrifying. Not so much death itself, but pain. Even when you bear with it, aha, aha ha ha.
Tap, tap. He wasn't intending to, but his cane made a good deal of noise against the limestone tile. Tap, 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 tap. The boulder rolled irritably against his cane, attempting to break it. Leopold scowled in reply, hoisting it into the air.
You do realize I need this? It isn't as if I can just roll around, as you do. But then, I imagine that being made of stone, you can't feel quite as I do. You probably can't feel anything at all, and furthermore.
But before Leopold could eviscerate the carefree boulder, a great shape sailed through the sky above them, and he looked nothing like he had before. Dragunov was pockmarked with scars and wounds from his near-eternal battle with Lazarus, but not only that, strange, wispy tails of smog and something hung around his scales, visible to only those who knew where to look. And even distant as the great dragon was, Leopold not only knew how to look, but was suddenly aware. He could sense Dragunov's waking thoughts, increasingly clouded over not just with revenge, but with pain. The hooks that Leopold himself had placed into Dragunov in a foolish attempt to siphon off some of that power had grown strange and infected, and not by anything that Leopold had seen before. The wounds felt awful and alien, lesions on otherwise blemishless scale. He felt nauseous, not just at the strange contrails of energy leaking from them, but from his own role. Why had he done it? Why, knowing the pointless of attempting to rule over a domain that would eventually falter in the first place? Hadn't he imagined anything like this? Had he really been so blind as not to think of consequence?
Dragunov!
Leopold called up to the sky, and for a minute he hoped that Dragunov might hear, either to land and speak to him, or to kill the old man where he stood, but Dragunov snapped at the air and invisible enemies, perhaps assuming that the raindrops themselves had been agents of Lazarus.
Damn it!
The boulder rolled into his leg. Repeatedly. It shone a vivid, colorful opal black.
I notice you, rock. There is nothing we can do. I can do. This world will die, and I've helped make it a painful death, rather than a gentle one. Surely, you can leave an old man to his regrets.
But, unfortunately, stones are not known for their subtlety, and with great difficulty, the stone being managed to heft itself onto Leopold's good leg, finally getting his full attention, and perhaps a sense of revenge, however tempered. Swearing for the second time in seconds, Leopold swatted the ground angrily with his cane, though he took some care to avoid hitting the boulder itself. It began to spin in place, light shining outwards from the tiny pavilion they were in, and Leopold followed the pattern of light.
You want me to go there? Bah! I suppose it is somewhat better than basking in my own self-pity. I'll have you know that if it's a trap, I won't fight back. You may do as you like.
The boulder rolled around some more, and Leopold had the distinct impression it was sighing in exasperation. Smiling with tightly bound lips at this minor victory, the old man and the boulder left the ruined villa for a path into the woodlands. It wasn't that long before he saw Crimsolino, half asleep from exhaustion. Perched on a tall branch that was floating some distance above the ground with no apparent hold, the harpy would have seemed almost comical, but for the burden against her eyes, it was clear that whatever force had compelled her to come this far, it could carry her no further. Unlike, perhaps, the branch itself, which seemed content to move around in the empty air. Her eyes shot open, accompanied by a loud squawk at the sight of him, as Crimsolino hopped from the levitating wood to the ground, buffeting it carefully with her wings as she fell. It seemed the logical thing to do, for it seemed the gravitation here was different, it felt heavier and higher, but seemed lower and more languid, and for the first time since he was young, Leopold was quite glad not to have wings to worry about.
Leopold, thank goodness I found you. Mammon and I have been quite overcome. I have done the best I can in the circumstances, but the circumstances are...
She snorted in defiance to the branch above her head. It fell, and her eyes lidded, beak curling into a vicious snarl before wreathing the shifting thing that had been a branch in a peal of white-hot fire.
As you can see, I am quite concerned for dear Mammon. He is not hardened against these oddities, like you or I are. So far they have been harmless, but...
As glad as he was to see her, he knew well the look of someone who would not rule out force to restore order, or protect those that they cared for. It must be reflected in his eyes, after all.
Of course. Have I been distant long? I remember vaguely eating some of that odd fruit that Mammon said was safe. It was quite the opposite. We both cautioned you against it. Ah, well, I was quite happy at the time.
It made him smile to admit it, even if there wasn't time enough to focus on little happinesses right now.
Sweet Leopold, you had not mentioned that you found, A friend, I believe. I would have been moping not too far from you if it were not for this persistent piece of rebel. Chances are that you and Mr. Mammon would be quite farther in good fortune if you replaced my services with its.
The boulder shone a mild green, which Crimsolino tittered at.
Oh, such grace, indeed, it does seem to have more manners than you, Leopold. But I'm afraid self-effacement doesn't suit you, and there will be time for it when we have figured out how to elude whatever is eating away at the island. I do not usually allow this, but, desperate times.
Before either he or the boulder could protest, one talon had clasped him, and the other the polychromatically shifting boulder, and Crimsolino had, with some difficulty and a great deal of hemming and hawing, lifted herself into the air, occasionally pausing to wheeze fire and flail her wings in protest. It was not an easy flight, made only possible by the oddly acting thermals and gravity, which were also enemies, for suddenly, the ability for Crimsolino to fly at all would deplete or vanish, sending the three of them dropping through grey skies at a molasses slow, yet terrifying pace. But her maw was set in a vicious persistence, for Crimsolino was a duchess, and duchesses are not known to yield. Some hours had passed before they made it to where Mammon was hiding under a large bough of fallen leaves thrown together with string. He ran out at their arrival, smiling but obviously concerned, as one should be when the weather creates droplets of wet hail that shatter like tiny crystals upon landing.
Boss. Crim. Boulder. Wow, no way, have we met before?
The boulder shone red, and Mr. Mammon chortled.
Small world, small world. I have a good memory for minerals, call it a talent. Crim, I figure we're gonna have to go somewhere with actual shelter. These raindrops are.
Crimsolino raised her wings fully, like crimson pyres of fallen feathers, some of her plumage shook loose and fell to the ground where the shattering rain had struck her. Showing no pain but a great deal of rueful displeasure, she clucked quietly.
Asymmetry is in, I hope. You're quite right, dearest Mammon. We'll die out here. And quickly.
All three were silent, before she added, somewhat hesitantly.
I do have an idea, of sorts, though I cannot say it is one that you'll welcome freely. Sweet Leopold. Will you allow me to fly ahead? And will you follow me closely? I must beg your trust here, but, I feel we have no choice.
He had a clue about what the harpy was planning. There were after all, only so many actual settlements they had seen. But to go and beg for sanctuary from those he had wronged.
I am not proud in this moment, we have no choice. If the option is between letting us die, or at the very least, forcing you bear any more damage upon that spectacular plumage, it is not a choice, is it? Lead on. I will deal with whatever they wish to do with me.
Hard as it was to read the expressions of the Duchess, he felt fairly certain that she was smiling, in her own manner. Then, with a great squawk, she was in the air, slightly more capable of flight without the weight of both he and the boulder under her claws.
You sure you're going to be all right, Chief? This, Leo. This might mean. It means what it shall be. And I might be able to write some things, at least. You see, I think I'm part of the reason this is happening, perhaps that is one of the reasons I was pulled away. Dragunov isn't just awake because of me. Something I did, to him.
Leopold's mind raced. His perpetually sour grimace turned into a line so thin it looked as if someone had strung razor wire across his face, then fell into open free fall.
By all that's holy! Mammon! Have you ever felt the wind of fortune at your back?
Mr. Mammon was staring at Crimsolino's retreating figure, expression unreadable.
Often, boss. You got a good feeling. Not good, exactly. But perhaps Perhaps we shall have the chance to make it so. Follow me. Let's see if I can do this. HRMN.
Leopold's magic was much weaker than the magic of that star-eyed girl, for though it was very formulaic and showy, it was correlatingly without substance. The tiny red dome that smelled faintly of embers and elderberries gave off a metallic clang whenever falling, and occasionally, rising, debris came up against it, shuddering and seeming as if it might dissipate at any moment. But copying came easily enough to him, and a pale imitation is still an imitation. Mr. Mammon stared at the dome, or past it, whistling.
Is it supposed to go like this? I mean, you seem like the sort of guy who knows these things, but... No, I don't know, I mean... But I can't think so. I fucked up.
The two of them moved on in silence. Mr. Mammon occasionally shooting the old man sympathetic glances. Leopold's shoulders sagged, the edge of his face seemed to fall inward, and it was only the occasional clattering of his weak spell that kept him from seeming as if he might fall against the ground and shatter, himself.
Hey, there. We all make mistakes, boss, you just made more awful ones.
Beside himself, Leopold couldn't help but smile a bit.
That's not very helpful, Mammon. Not designed to be, it's not like people, not like humans to forgive or absolve easily. I can't speak for all demons either, but, long lives tend to make for more mellow people. What I'm saying is that you're acknowledging things. As to what they say, well, that'll come when they get there.
Crimsolino pulled towards them slowly, fighting a sudden gale of warm air that was pushing dirt and leaves up into the stratosphere. Despite it all, she was making headway and not losing ground, but...
The rest's up to you. And I trust you on that, we've gotten this far. But do you think there's anything you can do for Krim?
Leopold thought, and nothing came to mind. He could probably burn away some of the excess air, but all that would do is make things stuffier and harder to breathe, and the air was already thick and tasteless and unpleasant. He could lower the already weakening shield, but with the earth itself trying to flee, that seemed unwise. Cursing his weakness again, Leopold was shocked to see the boulder unworriedly roll out from underfoot, and began hurling itself against a nearby tree. Normally, as strong and solid as the boulder folk were, it would have taken some time to have the desired effect, but... Not only did the oaken tree fall, but it split smartly along the trunk into two almost equal halves, which then began to fracture, as well. Seeing her chance, Crimsolino threw herself through the sky towards the splitting wood, shimmying down from one rising beam to another. The sight would have been ridiculous, but for her nervous, coughing gouts of fire and the talon marks left in pieces of wood whirling in tiny circles through the now off-green sky. Finally landing on the ground wingtips first, Crimsolino sighed, and flame came with it, scorching ground that was already barren. It spoke to the character of the Duchess that she took no further time to rest, retreating under the fading red shield almost as quickly as the quietly proud boulder.
So sorry, Leopold. Mammon. It's too much to keep flying ahead. I do not think I can, not in this weather, if it is weather. It as if the air itself is a noose.
The Duchess said nothing for a moment, though she did look quietly grateful at Mr. Mammon quietly easing the dirt from her feathers and lining them back into semi-symmetry.
Ah, and thank you, stony friend. It'd have been a less pleasant landing by far without some quick thinking.
She chuckled nervously, and they all did, save the boulder, who simply went a quiet off-white. It didn't seem truly dangerous yet, this collapse, but...
I imagine if we can keep at this pace, we shall reach that compound before too many days have passed. There are fragments of paved road that serve well enough as waypoints, and I have a good sense of direction.
She said nothing of the ruined structures she had seen, for though it saddened her greatly to see art destroyed, there was nothing to be done. She had no hands, after all, and even if she had, survival took precedence for now. And perhaps it was a sign of a useless nobility, or perhaps of something great, but she wished that were not the case.
Well, we'll just go on foot. No need for you to put yourself into the line of fire for our sakes, even if you're pretty fiery yourself. Right, Leo?
Catching his goatee with one mauve hand, Mr. Mammon pulled it into its usual jagged and ramshackle lightning-like shape. In the past, there would have been more hesitation at his cautious words, but his golden eyes didn't refuse to meet Leopold, or stare nervously up into the sky.
Right. And we'll take our time at that. As much as time is always against us, rash action is the domain of fools, and as foolish as I can be, I'm going to avoid falling into the same mistakes, the same patterns this time. I am sure of it.
Above them, the little red dome hissed, flickering as something crashed against it, then reforming, slightly more vibrant and red. Leopold sighed, as it dimmed once more.
Well, and we might have to move slowly for reasons of caution as well. I'm afraid this won't hold much longer. It can't be worse than the months of howling, can it?
Leopold stared defiantly towards the sky, and indeed the weather did not threaten to get any worse, or at least any more dangerous, at least not at the moment. Far beyond them, the great ruined black fragments of roadway mixed with dirt of all colors, healthy browns and black, tans and greens, and entirely sand-like grey substances that seemed more akin to bookbinder's paste than soil. And past the ruins of those ruins, great lights shone up into the sky, casting patterns of green and white against the ominously gathering clouds, at once a beacon, and a threat. Chapter end.